He threw his disabled mother out with nothing, not knowing she was hiding $11 million and a lesson he'd never forget. Margaret Lewis, a 58-year-old black woman in a wheelchair, had raised her adopted son, Victor, since he was 4. She gave him everything. Food when she barely ate. School fees when she worked double shifts. Comfort when nightmares kept him awake. People in town called her the woman with nothing but kindness. But nobody knew she also had a secret worth $11 million. Not yet. Victor grew older, colder, and more entitled. He wanted a bigger car, a bigger house, a bigger life. And Margaret's old wooden home embarrassed him. One night he stood in front of her with a blank expression. "Mom, you need to move out. I'm selling this place." Margaret blinked, shocked. "I raised you here," she whispered. "Exactly," he replied, "and I'm done living poor." He packed her bags himself. And by morning, she was on the doorstep, alone. Margaret rolled her wheelchair toward town, fighting tears that kept blurring her vision. The wind was cold, scraping against her cheeks, but not as cold as the words her adopted son had thrown at her that morning. She tightened her shawl, trying to steady her breathing, but each push of her wheels felt heavier than the last. Cars rushed past, drivers barely glancing in her direction, just another old woman on the side of the road. Then a faded blue pickup truck slowed, its engine rumbling softly as it pulled over. The window rolled down and a young woman leaned out. She had warm brown eyes, the kind that noticed pain even when someone tried to hide it. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" Margaret hesitated. Pride always made her pause, but loneliness pushed her forward. "I just need a place to sit for a while," she murmured. The woman nodded instantly, as if helping her was the most natural thing in the world. "Hop in, I'm Nora." She parked, stepped out, and gently helped guide Margaret's wheelchair onto a ramp in the back. Her movements were careful, respectful, nothing rushed, nothing careless. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. When was the last time anyone had handled her with such tenderness? They drove into town, the hum of the engine creating a quiet space where Margaret could finally breathe. Nora didn't pry, she didn't stare. She simply drove, glancing back every so often with a reassuring smile, as if silently saying, "You're safe with me." At a small cafe on the corner, Nora helped her inside and found a warm booth near a window. The waitress recognized Nora immediately. "Hey hun, back again?" she asked kindly. Nora smiled sheepishly. "Just need a couple cups of coffee today, and a sandwich for my friend." Friend. The word hit Margaret harder than she expected. They barely knew each other, but Nora wasn't treating her like a burden. She wasn't treating her like a stranger either. When the food came, Nora pushed the plate toward her. "Eat okay? You look like you haven't had a proper meal today." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the sandwich. She didn't realize how hungry she was until she tasted the first bite. Nora sat across from her, sipping coffee, her eyes gentle and patient. Something about her reminded Margaret of a mother bird shielding her chick from the storm, soft, protective, instinctively kind. After a while, Margaret finally spoke. "My son, he told me to leave this morning." Nora's expression softened instantly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Margaret nodded, swallowing hard. "I raised him since he was 10, gave him everything I could, and today he said I was a burden." Nora reached across the table and placed her hand over Margaret's trembling fingers. Her touch was warm, grounding. "You're not a burden," she said firmly. "Anyone who can't see your worth doesn't deserve you." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again, but these tears weren't from heartbreak. They were from the shock of being defended, of being valued. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked quietly. Nora hesitated, brushing a loose curl behind her ear. "Because I know what it's like to have no one to lean on." Her voice quivered, but she steadied herself. "I'm a single mom. My son is 5. Some days we barely scrape by. Some days I feel invisible. So when I see someone struggling," she shrugged softly, "I help because I hope someone would do the same for me." Margaret stared at her, stunned by the sincerity. This young woman had problems of her own, responsibilities that weighed heavier than most would ever understand. Yet she chose kindness. She chose compassion. She chose to care. "My own son cast me aside. Yet a stranger treated me like family." The thought echoed through Margaret's heart like a prayer. She hadn't felt this seen, this heard in years. She took a long breath, calming the ache inside her chest. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. "You don't know what this means to me." But Nora didn't want credit. She simply squeezed Margaret's hand gently. "You're not alone today," she said, "not while I'm here." They sat together for almost an hour, talking, eating, sharing quiet moments that felt strangely comforting. Nora told her about her son, about juggling 2 part-time jobs, about dreams she'd buried because life kept getting heavier. Margaret listened, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. By the time the plates were cleared, something unspoken had formed between them, a fragile bond made of empathy, shared struggle, and unexpected kindness. When Nora wheeled Margaret back toward the truck, she paused. "Where do you want to go now?" Margaret looked at the road stretching ahead, uncertain, but for the first time that day not afraid. "Anywhere," she whispered, "as long as it's not back to him." Nora nodded with deep understanding. "Then come with me for now. I'll make sure you're okay." Margaret blinked at her, stunned. "Why?" Nora smiled softly, pushing a stray tear from Margaret's cheek. "Because no good person should face their worst day alone." She didn't know, and couldn't have imagined, that the small kindness she offered on that cold roadside would change her entire life. But fate had already started turning, quietly, gently, leading both women toward a future neither of them saw coming. Nora's apartment was small, warm, and cluttered with signs of a life spent juggling too many responsibilities at once. A child's backpack hung from a chair, crayons were scattered on the coffee table, and a stack of unpaid bills sat neatly rubber-banded near the kitchen counter. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt safe, something Margaret desperately needed. Nora helped her inside, letting her settle on the worn sofa before beginning to unpack her bag. As she lifted it, something metallic thudded onto the floor. A small, old metal lockbox, scuffed from years of use, rested at their feet. Nora bent to pick it up. "This yours, ma'am?" she asked, examining the weight of it in her hands. It was heavier than it looked. Margaret swallowed. "Yes, be careful with that." Nora turned it over, noticing the lock. "It's locked." She didn't pry further, it wasn't her business. Curiosity flickered across her face for a split second before she respectfully handed it back. Margaret held the box in her lap. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her breath trembling faintly. This box carried decades of secrets, choices she'd made, sacrifices she'd endured, and a future she had carefully written long before her adopted son had betrayed her. Nora noticed her hesitation. "If you don't want to open it now, you don't have to. We can wait until you're comfortable." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, tonight is as good a time as any. You deserve to know who you brought into your home." She reached into a tiny slit she had sewn into the lining of her purse. From it, she pulled a tiny key, thin, old, almost fragile. With trembling fingers, she slid it into the lock. The click echoed through the small apartment like a thunderclap. Inside lay documents stacked carefully, each preserved in protective sleeves. Nora leaned closer, not intruding but unable to hide her curiosity. Margaret lifted the first stack, property deeds, multiple ones, each with her signature at the bottom. Acres of land she'd purchased decades ago when the world was different and she was full of hope. Then came bank statements, thick with zeros Nora had never seen outside of a lottery commercial. Old stock certificates followed, yellowed with age but clearly valuable. Some belonged to companies Nora recognized as giants today. Margaret's hands moved slowly, reverently, as if each paper carried a lifetime. Nora felt her heart thudding. She had never been near this kind of wealth. Her entire savings account had once hit $900 and she'd felt like a queen. But this was unimaginable. Then Margaret lifted the final envelope, heavy, official, stamped by a law office downtown. At the top of the will was a summary page. It listed her total estimated net worth. Nora squinted, then froze. $11,372,000. Her hands shot to her mouth. "Ma'am, you're rich." The question slipped out before she could soften it. She wasn't thinking of money, she was thinking of the battered wheelchair, the old sweater, the woman who had entered her apartment with nothing but heartbreak. Margaret saw the shock in her eyes and let out a small, weary chuckle. "Rich in money," she murmured, "poor in love." Her voice cracked at the last word. Nora's chest tightened. She sat beside her. "Why didn't you tell your son? Wouldn't he have treated you better?" Margaret shook her head. "If wealth is the only reason someone loves you, then they don't love you at all." She traced her finger along the edge of a deed. "I wanted him to grow into a man of character. I wanted him to value kindness, not money, so I kept this to myself. I always believed he'd become someone who saw me as a blessing, not a burden." Her eyes dimmed. "But greed exposes the truth. And love, real love, cannot grow where selfishness lives." Nora stared at her, stunned by how calmly she spoke of such deep wounds. "Does anyone else know about this?" she asked. "No," Margaret whispered. "Just my lawyer and now you." Nora blinked. "Why trust me?" Margaret looked around the tiny apartment, at the cracked tiles, the mismatched dishes, the small boys drawing tape to the fridge that read, "I love you, Mom. Because you helped me when you thought I had nothing," she said softly. "People show who they truly are when there's nothing to gain." Nora felt tears prick her eyes but forced them back. "I just did what anyone with a heart would do." Margaret shook her head. "No, most people would have driven past, or pretended they didn't see an old woman crying on the road." Nora felt her throat tighten. She had never imagined this gentle stranger carried such a fortune, nor such loneliness. Margaret continued sorting the documents, carefully laying them out on the coffee table. "Everything in this box, every dollar, every property I earned through decades of sacrifice, hard work, careful planning. I didn't come from wealth." She paused. "I built it." Nora admired her even more. A billionaire born rich is one thing, but a woman who clawed her way to wealth through grit, that was a different kind of strength. "What do you plan to do now?" Nora asked quietly. Margaret gazed at the document listing her net worth, then at the child's drawing on the fridge, then at Nora. Her voice softened. "I don't know yet, but I do know one thing." She closed the lockbox gently. "Money never protected me from heartbreak, but kindness, your kindness, gave me somewhere to breathe." Nora placed her hand on hers, steady and sincere. "You're safe here, and you're not alone anymore." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the truth sink in. For the first time in years, she felt a strange, fragile hope rising within her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, in a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and a stranger who treated her better than her own son, she felt something priceless. She felt wanted. And she had no idea that this night, this moment, would set off a chain of events that would change not only her life, but Nora's as well, forever. Nora sat quietly on the edge of the couch, watching Margaret pull the lockbox closer as if it were a chest of memories rather than money. The dim light of the single lamp cast soft shadows over her weathered face, making her look both fragile and unbreakable at once. After a long breath, Margaret finally spoke. "I suppose you deserve to know everything." Nora nodded, giving her all the time she needed. Margaret clasped her hands together, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of years she had carried silently. "It started decades ago," she said, staring down at the papers. "I was working as a part-time nurse's aide. I wasn't earning much. Life was simple but difficult. Then one day after your grandfather, my husband, passed, the insurance company sent a payout." She gave a bitter smile. "Just enough to cover funeral costs and a little more. Most people would have held on to it, saved it for emergencies, but something in me, something whispered that I should take a risk." Nora tilted her head, captivated. Margaret continued, her voice growing steadier. "I heard about a small tech startup. Barely a dozen people in a cramped office over a bakery. People laughed at them, thought they were dreamers playing with computers. Even my friends told me, don't waste your money on foolish boys with gadgets." She paused, the memory sharp in her mind. "But I believed in them, not because I understood technology. I didn't. I believed in the passion I saw in their eyes. They reminded me of my husband when he talked about building a future for us." Nora felt chills. It was strange hearing a life-changing decision boiled down to instinct. Margaret continued. "So I invested, a small amount, nothing extraordinary. At first, the company barely held on. They struggled. They nearly shut down twice. I kept thinking I'd made a stupid mistake." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Then one year, everything changed. The company released a product that the world suddenly needed, and overnight they exploded. Investors poured in, stocks soared, and that tiny insurance payout I gambled," she tapped the lockbox gently, "it turned into millions." Nora's eyes widened with admiration. "That must have felt unreal." "It did," Margaret whispered. "And for a moment, I thought about what I could buy: new house, new clothes, a new life." Then her voice softened, tinged with regret. "But Victor was young then, and I had seen what money did to people, how it made them lazy, greedy, entitled." Her eyes shimmered with an old pain. "I didn't want my son to grow up thinking everything came easy. I wanted him to have character, to build something himself, so I kept the money secret." Nora leaned forward. "You never told him?" "Not even when he got older." Margaret shook her head firmly. "Not once, and I watched him grow. At first he was a sweet boy, grateful, hardworking, respectful, but somewhere along the way," her voice cracked, "he learned to want without earning." Nora swallowed, remembering how Margaret had arrived at her apartment earlier that night, hurt, abandoned, carrying nothing but heartbreak in a metal box. Margaret's tone grew sorrowful. "I paid for his college, quietly cleared his debts. Helped him buy his first car. But instead of learning gratitude, he learned entitlement. The more I gave, the less he appreciated." She stared down at her lap, fighting tears. And when I finally said I couldn't help anymore, he turned cold, distant, angry. Nora felt anger rising in her chest, not just for the rudeness, but for the betrayal of a woman who had given everything. And today, Nora whispered, is that why he threw you out? Because you wouldn't give him more. Margaret closed her eyes, the memory slicing through her like a knife. I told him no, just once, and he told me I was useless, a burden, dead weight. She opened her eyes again, but this time something in them had changed, something sharper, something colder. He didn't just reject me, Margaret said softly. He revealed who he truly is. Nora felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Margaret, you hid the fortune so he'd become a good man. Yes, Margaret nodded slowly. I wanted him to grow with values, to understand struggle, to learn empathy, to know that life is about what you give, not what you demand. She paused, her gaze turning to the documents spread across the table. But he failed that test. Nora took a steady breath. So what do you plan to do now? For the first time since Nora had met her, Margaret's expression grew cold, sharp enough to make the air feel heavier. Now, she whispered, now he'll learn what greed costs. Nora felt chills travel down her spine. Margaret continued with a calmness that was more terrifying than anger. I will rewrite my will. I will change every beneficiary. Everything I built, everything I earned will go to those who showed me kindness, those who know how to value a human heart. She lifted her chin, her voice steady and unwavering. Victor expects to inherit millions. He thinks I have nothing now, so he gives me nothing. Her eyes hardened. But one day he will learn the truth, and when he realizes what he threw away, what he discarded, a cold, quiet fury settled into her voice. That will be his lesson. Nora felt a mixture of awe, sorrow, and fierce devotion for this woman who had suffered quietly for so long. She took Margaret's hand, squeezing gently. Whatever happens next, she said softly, you won't face it alone. Margaret nodded. I know, because sometimes, Nora thought, family isn't blood. Sometimes it's kindness that binds people together. And that night, surrounded by old papers and new truths, Margaret made a silent promise. The future would not belong to the greedy, only to the worthy. Victor believed he was untouchable the moment he slammed the door behind Margaret. In his mind, he had finally freed himself from responsibility, from guilt, from the silent reminder that he was the man she hoped he'd become. With the house in his name, he wasted no time turning it into his playground. Within a single week, he sold it, pressured the agent to close fast, and walked away with a check he believed would last forever. Everyone praised his win. Friends cheered. Acquaintances envied him. And Victor, grinning like a king, strutted through the dealership, pointing at the shiniest luxury car he could find. He didn't ask about mileage or reliability, just the badge on the hood. Wrap it up, he bragged, tossing the cashier's check like it was pocket change. The first night he owned the car, he drove it across town at full speed, windows down, music blasting, pride swelling so high it drowned the last echo of his mother's voice. Soon he started throwing parties, loud ones, where strangers filled the house he rented, drinking his expensive liquor, sitting on furniture he hadn't paid for yet, admiring the car parked outside as if it were a throne. Victor soaked in their admiration like oxygen. I'm finally living, he told them. Freedom looks good on me. But freedom, at least the kind he wanted, cost money, money he didn't understand, money he didn't track. Bills came, he tossed them aside. Taxes came. Ignored them, payments came, he didn't care. He believed tomorrow would magically take care of itself, but tomorrow came violently. The first hit was the letter from the county office, property tax delinquent. Victor read it 3 times, unable to process the amount. It was more than he thought, much more. He crumpled the letter and threw it across the room, telling himself it could wait. It couldn't. The car company called next. Mr. Hale, this is your second missed payment. He forced a laugh. Send me the bill again. Must have lost it. He hadn't lost it. He simply didn't have the money. His job, the one thing he had left, began slipping too. He overslept after parties, skipped shifts, ignored calls from his supervisor. You can't expect me to live at work, he snapped when they confronted him, but reality doesn't bend to arrogance. On a dreary Thursday morning, his supervisor called him into the office. Victor, we're letting you go. He gave a bitter laugh. You're firing one of your best employees, his supervisor sighed. Your attendance alone destroys that claim. Victor stormed out, chest puffed, rage boiling, but panic already rising beneath the surface. Without his job, the bills grew teeth. The bank sent notices. The dealership left voicemails. Debt collectors began calling so frequently he set his phone to silent. The same friends who once filled his house stopped answering his texts. The people who cheered for his car now ignored him when he passed them in it. And the money, the money he thought would never end, evaporated like morning mist. He tried selling the car. The dealer's offer was embarrassingly low after depreciation and missed payments. He tried borrowing from friends. They suddenly had excuses. He tried gambling his last savings, desperate to multiply it quickly. He lost almost everything in a single night. By the third week, Victor's confidence cracked. By the fourth, it shattered. He sat alone in his now half-empty rental house, listening to the echo of silence, something he never noticed when he had noise to hide behind. His stomach growled. He ignored it. His phone buzzed. Another bill. He tossed it aside. His head fell into his hands. For the first time since Margaret left, he thought about her, about the wheelchair, about the quiet way she left without arguing, about how he didn't even ask where she would go. His heart twisted strangely, guilt mixing with fear. He didn't want to admit it, but he needed her, not for money, not for support, but because she was the one person who had always stood by him, even when he didn't deserve it. Desperation gnawed at him until he finally grabbed his keys and drove to the cafe she used to sit at. He burst through the doors, scanning every table. Elderly women filled a corner booth. A young mother fed her child oatmeal. A retired bus driver read the newspaper, but not Margaret. She was nowhere. He checked the patio, the sidewalk, the parking lot. Nobody had seen her lately. He asked the server, the one who always brought his mother tea. "Have you seen her?" he asked, breathless. The server frowned. "Margaret, not for weeks. She used to come every morning, you know that." His throat tightened. "She doesn't come anymore?" "No." The server's tone held a hint of sadness. "I hope she's all right." Victor stepped outside, gripping the railing as the world suddenly felt too big, too loud, too hostile. For the first time in his life, he felt small. He looked at the empty seat where she once sat, where she waited for him countless times, where she ate alone when he didn't show up, where she smiled at strangers because he didn't smile at her. And the weight of his choices finally fell on him. He didn't know it yet, couldn't know it, but the lesson he was about to learn would be the harshest one of his life. Victor woke to the sound of knocking, sharp, impatient, official. He stumbled out of bed, the room spinning from another sleepless night. Unpaid bills littered the floor like fallen leaves. Empty cans and takeout boxes filled the counter. His once perfect life had rotted from the inside out, but he was too exhausted to notice anymore. When he opened the door, he found a postal courier holding a thick envelope. "Signature, sir." Victor scribbled his name with shaking hands and shut the door quickly, sensing something heavy inside the envelope, something that made his stomach twist. He sat at the kitchen table, the one piece of furniture he hadn't sold, and stared at the envelope for almost a full minute. It wasn't the government. It wasn't the bank. It wasn't another bill. This envelope carried a familiar handwriting that froze his breath. Margaret Hale, his mother. His throat tightened as he tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter neatly folded, written in her elegant cursive. He could almost hear her voice as he read the first line. "My son," it began. His heart dropped into his stomach. He swallowed hard and continued. "You pushed me out when I needed you most." The words stabbed deeper than he expected. He blinked rapidly, trying to push away the guilt that surged. He kept reading. "You told me I was a burden. You told me I was in your way. You never asked where I would go or how I would live. You closed the door behind me without once looking back." His breath quickened. He remembered that day, the way he had shouted, the coldness in his voice, the way she had rolled her wheelchair toward the door without arguing. At the time he felt powerful, now he felt sick. "So now," the letter continued, "I am leaving my fortune to the one who welcomed me in." Victor froze. Fortune? What fortune? What was she talking about? He dug deeper into the envelope, confusion turning to dread. There were documents inside, legal documents, notarized, stamped with official seals. His vision blurred as he pulled out the revised will. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "Last Will and Testament of Margaret Hale." He scanned the pages desperately, looking for familiar words, looking for his name. He found it only once. "My son, Victor Hale, is to receive nothing." His breath stopped. He felt the ground tilt beneath him. He kept reading, hand over his mouth, heart pounding like a drum. "Every dollar of my estate, valued at $11,372,000, will be transferred to the woman who showed me compassion when my own blood did not." $11 million. His mother had been a millionaire all this time, and she had never told him. He read the name again. Nora West. The stranger, the roadside helper, the woman he'd never met. The woman who had taken her in when he threw her out. He reread the name several times, the letters twisting through his mind like a knife. Nora West. He had thrown away his mother and her fortune because of pride, laziness, and entitlement, and she had given everything to someone who had helped her once, someone who treated her with more love in one afternoon than he had in years. His body began to shake, the room blurred. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, the documents scattering around him like broken pieces of the life he had destroyed himself. The will lay open on the tile beside him. His mother's handwriting stared back at him, soft but unforgiving. "You showed me your heart the day you told me to leave, and I showed you mine the day I signed this will." His chest tightened painfully. He clutched the letter to his chest, tears spilling down his face. He had never cried over her before, not when she begged him to spend time with her, not when she tried to give him wisdom he didn't want, not even when she rolled away from his doorstep. But now the tears came in hot, uncontrollable waves. Regret hit him like a storm. He remembered her waiting for him at the cafe. He remembered ignoring her calls. He remembered mocking her worries. He remembered treating her like she was nothing. Now she had proved she was everything. The weight of the truth crushed him. He had not only lost money, he had lost the last chance to be the son she deserved, the last chance to apologize, the last chance to undo the damage. He slammed his fist onto the floor, the sound echoing through the empty house. "Mom," he whispered, voice cracking on the word he hadn't used in weeks. But she wasn't there. She wasn't coming back, and he had no idea where she was, no idea how to find her. No idea if she would ever want to see him again. He grabbed the will, rereading it through blurry eyes. One sentence burned more than the rest. "A stranger treated me better than my own son." Victor pressed the paper to his forehead, feeling the truth sear through him. The stranger had become family, and he, the blood son, had become the stranger. In that moment, surrounded by the ruins of his arrogance, Victor finally understood what he had thrown away. Not just $11 million. Not just security, not just opportunity. He had thrown away love, and now it was gone forever. Meanwhile, Nora bought a spacious house with ramps, safety rails, and everything Margaret needed for comfort. Margaret's old wheelchair was replaced with a sleek motorized one. She finally lived the life she deserved. Peace, love, laughter, family. Nora's little daughter called her Grandma Maggie. And Margaret finally felt loved again. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. Months later, Victor found their address. He dropped to his knees in front of Margaret. "I'm sorry, Mom. Please forgive me. I'll change. I'll be better." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "I forgive you," she whispered. His face brightened. "But forgiveness," she continued, "is not the same as trust." Victor froze. "You left me when I had nothing," she said gently. "And Nora lifted me up when she had nothing." She reached out and held Nora's hand. "This is my family now." Victor burst into tears. But the lesson was his to live with. Years later, Margaret created a foundation called Hearts That Lift. It helped abandoned elders, disabled single parents, and any soul cast aside by family. Because Margaret believed one truth. Blood makes you related, kindness makes you family. And that legacy, worth more than $11 million, lived on forever.